What happened next changed everything. Picture this. You're standing at the altar, surrounded by 300 guests. Your bride walking toward you in her dream dress, and your best friend leans over and whispers 4 words that shatter your entire world. This is the story of Marcus Thompson, a 32-year-old marketing director from Portland, Oregon, whose wedding day became the most devastating and ultimately transformative moment of his life. Marcus had everything figured out, or so he thought. He'd been with Sarah Mitchell for 4 years. They'd bought a house together in the Pearl District, and he'd spent 18 months planning what was supposed to be the perfect wedding at the Timberline Lodge on Mount Hood. 300 guests, a $15,000 photographer, and a reception that cost more than some people's cars. But sometimes life has other plans, and sometimes those plans come through the mouth of someone you trust completely. The morning of September 15th, 2024 started like any other wedding day. Marcus woke up at 6:30 a.m. in his downtown hotel room, surrounded by his groomsmen who'd turned his bachelor weekend into a 3-day celebration. His best man, David Chen, had been his roommate at Portland State University and had stood by his side through every major life decision for over a decade. David was the guy who helped him pick out the engagement ring, who'd spent countless hours listening to wedding planning stress, who'd organized the bachelor party in Las Vegas just 2 months earlier. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Marcus had invested not just financially, but emotionally. This wasn't just a wedding. It was the culmination of everything he'd worked toward since graduating college. Sarah represented stability, success, and the future he'd mapped out in his mind. She was a successful real estate agent, beautiful, charming, and everyone loved her. Their relationship looked perfect from the outside. The kind that made their friends jealous and their parents proud. What Marcus didn't know was that his perfect life was built on a foundation of lies, and that foundation was about to crumble in the most public way possible. But here's the thing about moments that destroy us. They also have the power to rebuild us into something stronger than we ever imagined. This story isn't just about betrayal. It's about what happens when a man decides to choose his own worth over social expectations, and how 30 seconds of courage can change the trajectory of an entire life. If you're someone who's ever felt like you were living someone else's version of your life, or if you've ever wondered what you'd do if everything you believed in turned out to be false, then stay with me. This story will challenge everything you think you know about love, loyalty, and what it really means to stand up for yourself. And if you find yourself invested in Marcus's journey, please consider subscribing to hear more stories of transformation and courage. Hit that like button if you believe everyone deserves to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Marcus Thompson had always been what people called a good guy, the kind of man who held doors open, remembered birthdays, and never raised his voice during arguments. Growing up in a middle-class family in Beaverton, Oregon, he'd learned early that success came through hard work, patience, and playing by the rules. His father, Robert, was an accountant who'd worked for the same firm for 28 years. His mother, Linda, was a high school English teacher who still graded papers at the kitchen table every Sunday night. The path Marcus chose seemed natural and inevitable. After graduating from Portland State with a degree in marketing, he landed a job at a mid-sized advertising agency downtown. Within 5 years, he'd worked his way up to director, managing a team of 12 people and overseeing campaigns for local businesses throughout the Pacific Northwest. His salary had grown from $35,000 to $85,000 annually, enough to afford the 2-bedroom craftsman house he'd purchased in the Pearl District and the reliable Honda Accord that got him to work every day. But the real prize, the thing that made Marcus feel like he'd truly made it, was Sarah Mitchell. They'd met at a networking event in downtown Portland 4 years earlier. Sarah was 28 at the time, a rising star in commercial real estate with striking auburn hair and a laugh that could fill a room. She had a way of making everyone around her feel like the most important person in the world, a quality that served her well in both her professional and personal life. Their courtship followed a predictable but comfortable pattern. Coffee dates turned into dinner dates, which became weekend trips to the Oregon coast. Sarah fit seamlessly into Marcus's life and social circle. His friends loved her energy and humor. His parents adored her traditional values and career ambition. She was the kind of woman who brought homemade cookies to office parties and remembered the names of everyone's children. David Chen had been there for all of it. As Marcus's best friend since their sophomore year at Portland State, David had watched the relationship develop with what seemed like genuine happiness for his friend. David worked as a software engineer at Nike, lived in a condo in Northwest Portland, and had remained single by choice, claiming he was too focused on his career for serious relationships. He spent most weekends hanging out with Marcus and Sarah, becoming almost like a third wheel that nobody minded having around. The proposal happened exactly 18 months before the wedding, on Sarah's 30th birthday. Marcus had planned it meticulously, taking her to Multnomah Falls where they'd had their first weekend trip together. He'd hidden the ring, a 2-carat diamond solitaire that had cost him 3 months' salary, in a picnic basket along with her favorite wine and cheese. When he dropped to one knee beside the waterfall, Sarah cried in a way that seemed completely genuine, saying yes before he could even finish his rehearsed speech. The engagement period became a whirlwind of decisions, vendors and expenses that seemed to multiply weekly. Sarah threw herself into wedding planning with the same intensity she brought to her real estate deals. She created spreadsheets, Pinterest boards, and timelines that would have impressed a project manager. Marcus found himself writing checks for things he'd never heard of, deposit after deposit for photographers, florists, caterers, and musicians. The venue they chose was perfect in every way. Timberline Lodge sat majestically on the slopes of Mount Hood, offering panoramic views of the Cascade Range and enough rustic elegance to satisfy both families. The September date seemed ideal, promising crisp fall weather and the kind of golden lighting that would make their photos look like something from a magazine. They booked the entire lodge for the weekend, planning a rehearsal dinner on Friday night and a reception that would last until midnight on Saturday. Guest list management became its own full-time job. Between Marcus's family, college friends, and work colleagues, plus Sarah's extensive network of family members, high school friends, and real estate industry contacts, they quickly reached 300 people. The invitations alone cost $1,200. Elegant cardstock with gold foil lettering that announced their union to everyone who mattered in their lives. David took his role as best man seriously, organizing a bachelor party weekend in Las Vegas that included 12 of Marcus's closest friends. They stayed at the Bellagio, saw a Cirque du Soleil show, and spent one memorable evening at a poker tournament where Marcus actually won $800. The weekend felt like the perfect send-off to single life, full of laughter, friendship, and the kind of bonding that made Marcus feel grateful for the people in his life. Sarah's bachelorette party happened the same weekend, a wine country tour in the Willamette Valley with 15 of her closest friends. She came back glowing, full of stories about tastings, spa treatments, and late-night conversations that made her feel even more confident about her decision to marry Marcus. She showed him hundreds of photos on her phone, everyone looking beautiful and happy in matching pink t-shirts that said, "Sarah's last fling before the ring." The week leading up to the wedding felt surreal. Marcus took Friday off to handle last-minute details and found himself running all over Portland, picking up his tuxedo, confirming final head counts with the caterer, and making sure the rings were sized correctly. Sarah seemed to be in 3 places at once, her phone constantly buzzing with messages from vendors, family members, and friends who were arriving from out of town. Thursday night, they had dinner with both sets of parents at a quiet restaurant in Northwest Portland. The conversation flowed easily, full of shared memories and excitement about the weekend ahead. Marcus's father made a toast about gaining a daughter, while Sarah's mother talked about how proud she was to see her little girl marrying such a wonderful man. Everyone seemed genuinely happy, the kind of happiness that comes from watching 2 people who clearly belong together take the next logical step in their relationship. But what Marcus didn't see, what nobody at that dinner table could have imagined, were the text messages Sarah was exchanging under the table. Messages that had been going on for months. Messages that would soon turn his perfect life into a public catastrophe. Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones capable of the deepest betrayal, and sometimes the life we think we want is actually a prison we've built for ourselves. The night before the wedding, Marcus lay in his hotel bed staring at the ceiling, feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness that seemed completely normal for a groom. He thought about the future he and Sarah were building together, the children they'd talked about having, the trips they'd planned to take, the life that seemed so certain and secure. He had no idea that less than 18 hours later, everything he believed about love, loyalty, and the people closest to him would be destroyed in front of 300 witnesses. The morning of September 15th dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of crystalline mountain air that made Mount Hood look close enough to touch. Marcus woke up at 6:30 a.m. to his phone buzzing with good luck messages from friends and family members who couldn't make it to Portland. The hotel room was chaos, with 5 groomsmen in various stages of getting ready, ties hanging everywhere, and someone's cologne creating a cloud that would have choked a horse. David was unusually quiet during the morning preparations. Normally the most talkative member of their friend group, he kept checking his phone and stepping out to take calls. When Marcus asked if everything was okay, David just nodded and mumbled something about work emergencies. Marcus was too focused on his own nerves to think much about it, but looking back, he'd realized this was when David was making the hardest decision of his life. The timeline for the day was military precise. Photos with the groomsmen started at 10 a.m., followed by a light lunch, then transportation to Timberline Lodge by 2 p.m. for more photos before the 4 p.m. ceremony. Sarah's timeline was similarly packed, with hair and makeup starting at 7 a.m., followed by photos with her bridesmaids, family portraits, and her own transportation to the lodge. They decided not to see each other before the ceremony, wanting to preserve that traditional moment of the bride walking down the aisle. The drive up to Mount Hood was spectacular. The leaves were just starting to turn, creating patches of gold and red against the evergreen forest. Marcus rode in a black SUV with his groomsmen, everyone making jokes and telling stories to calm his obvious nerves. The photographer, Jessica Reynolds, followed in her own car, occasionally asking them to pull over for shots of the group against the mountain backdrop. Timberline Lodge looked like something from a fairy tale. The massive timber structure sat majestically against the mountain, with flags snapping in the crisp breeze, and the kind of panoramic views that made people understand why this venue cost $15,000 to rent for the weekend. Marcus had been there twice during the planning process, but seeing it on his wedding day, with 300 guests already arriving and flowers everywhere, made it feel like a dream. The preparation for the ceremony took place in a suite on the second floor. Marcus changed into his charcoal gray tuxedo, a Tom Ford rental that had cost more than some people's monthly rent. The photographer captured every detail, the cufflinks his father had worn at his own wedding, the boutonniere being pinned to his lapel, the nervous laughter as his college roommate helped him with his bow tie. These were supposed to be the photos they'd look back on for the rest of their lives, tangible proof of the happiest day they'd ever known. At 3:30 p.m., the wedding coordinator, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia, who'd orchestrated over 200 weddings, gathered the wedding party for final instructions. The bridesmaids looked stunning in their dusty rose dresses, each carrying bouquets of white roses and eucalyptus. Sarah had chosen her sister Michelle as maid of honor, a decision that had caused some drama with her college roommate. But Marcus had stayed out of that particular battle. The guests were already seated when Marcus and his groomsmen took their positions at the front of the ceremony space. 300 people filled white wooden chairs arranged on the lodge's outdoor terrace, with Mount Hood providing a backdrop that belonged on magazine covers. Marcus recognized faces everywhere: his high school English teacher, Sarah's college sorority sisters, colleagues from both of their offices, extended family members he'd only met a handful of times. His parents sat in the front row, his mother dabbing her eyes with a tissue even before anything had happened. Sarah's parents were across the aisle, her father looking proud and slightly emotional in the way that fathers do when they're about to walk their daughters down the aisle. The whole scene felt surreal, like Marcus was watching someone else's life unfold from a distance. The string quartet began playing Pachelbel's Canon in D, the signal that the processional was about to begin. Marcus's heart started beating so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. This was the moment he'd imagined hundreds of times, The moment when he'd see Sarah in her wedding dress for the first time and know that everything in his life had led to this perfect instant. The bridesmaids came first, walking slowly down the aisle in pairs, each one smiling at the assembled guests. Marcus barely saw them, his eyes fixed on the spot where Sarah would appear. The music swelled, and then there she was, arm in arm with her father, wearing a dress that had taken 6 months to find and cost more than Marcus's first car. Sarah looked absolutely radiant. Her auburn hair was arranged in an elegant updo, with small white flowers woven throughout. The dress was classic and timeless, with delicate lace sleeves and a train that seemed to float behind her as she walked. She was smiling, but something about her expression seemed forced, though Marcus attributed that to normal wedding nerves. As Sarah and her father approached the altar, Marcus felt David shift beside him. His best man leaned closer, and for a moment Marcus thought David was going to make some joke to ease the tension, the way he always did in important moments. Instead, David's voice was barely above a whisper, urgent and pained in a way Marcus had never heard before. "She's cheating." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. For a second, he thought he'd misheard, that his nerves had somehow scrambled the sounds coming from his best friend's mouth. But David leaned even closer, his voice now desperate and filled with anguish. "She's cheating on you, Marcus. I'm sorry, I couldn't let you do this without knowing." Time seemed to slow down completely. Sarah was still walking toward him, now less than 20 feet away, her smile growing wider as she got closer. 300 guests were watching, most of them with their phones out, recording what they thought would be one of the happiest moments in Marcus and Sarah's lives. The photographer was capturing every step, every expression, every detail that was supposed to become part of their family history. But all Marcus could hear was David's voice, those 4 words echoing in his mind like a mantra of destruction. "She's cheating, she's cheating, she's cheating." The world around him became simultaneously hyper-focused and completely surreal. He could see individual flowers in Sarah's bouquet, could count the buttons on her father's suit jacket, could hear the shuffle of 300 people shifting in their seats with anticipation. David wasn't finished. Still whispering, still urgent, he continued, "I saw them together last week at the hotel downtown. I wasn't sure if I should tell you, but I couldn't stand here and watch you promise your life to someone who's been lying to you. I'm so sorry, Marcus. I'm so goddamn sorry." Sarah's father was about to hand her off to Marcus, the traditional moment when one man gives a woman to another, a ritual that suddenly felt hollow and meaningless. Marcus looked at Sarah's face, really looked at it, and for the first time noticed things he'd missed before. The way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, the slight flush in her cheeks that he'd attributed to excitement, but now seemed like guilt. The way she kept glancing at her phone, even during photos, claiming it was wedding coordinator messages, but maybe it was something else entirely. The officiant. Pastor Williams, from the Methodist church where Sarah's family attended, was beginning his opening remarks. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Marcus Thompson and Sarah Mitchell in holy matrimony." His voice seemed to come from underwater, distant and distorted. Marcus felt like he was drowning, standing there in front of 300 people while his entire reality crumbled around him. This was supposed to be the beginning of everything. Instead, it felt like the end of the world he'd spent 4 years building. But sometimes endings are actually beginnings in disguise, and sometimes the worst thing that can happen to us is also the most liberating. Marcus just didn't know it yet. Pastor Williams continued his opening remarks, his voice carrying across the terrace as if nothing had changed, as if Marcus's entire world hadn't just been shattered by 4 whispered words. Marriage is a sacred covenant, a commitment between 2 people to share their lives in honesty, faithfulness, and love. The irony of those words hit Marcus like a sledgehammer to the chest. Sarah had reached the altar now, her father kissing her cheek and placing her hand in Marcus's. The physical contact felt electric, but not in the romantic way he'd always imagined. Her hand was trembling, and when he looked into her eyes, he saw something he'd never noticed before: fear. Not the nervous excitement of a bride, but genuine gut-wrenching fear. The kind of fear that comes from knowing you're about to be caught in a lie that's bigger than you can handle. "Who gives this woman to be married to this man?" Pastor Williams asked, following the traditional script that suddenly felt like a cruel joke. "Her mother and I do," Sarah's father replied, his voice thick with emotion. Marcus watched the older man walk back to his seat, completely unaware that he'd just delivered his daughter to a ceremony that was about to become a disaster of epic proportions. Marcus's mind was racing, but time seemed to be moving in slow motion. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears, could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool mountain air. 300 people were watching expectantly, waiting for the beautiful ceremony they'd traveled from across the country to witness. His parents were beaming with pride in the front row. Sarah's mother was already crying happy tears. David was still standing beside him, and Marcus could feel his best friend's tension radiating like heat from a furnace. Part of Marcus wanted to turn around and demand details, to know everything about what David had seen and when and with whom. But another part of him already knew the truth in his bones, had probably known it for months without admitting it to himself. The late nights Sarah had been working, the mysterious text messages she'd quickly hide when he entered the room, the way she'd become suddenly secretive about her phone and her schedule, the business trips that seemed to increase in frequency over the past 6 months, the way she'd deflected his suggestions to move in together before the wedding, claiming she wanted to wait until after they were married to make it official. Pastor Williams was moving into the heart of the ceremony now. Marcus and Sarah have written their own vows, promises they wish to make to each other before God and this gathered community. He turned to Marcus first. "Marcus, would you share your vows with Sarah?" This was the moment Marcus had practiced hundreds of times in front of his bathroom mirror. He'd spent weeks crafting these words, wanting them to be perfect, to capture everything he felt about Sarah and their future together. He reached into his jacket pocket where the folded paper waited, the words he'd agonized over and memorized. But instead of pulling out his vows, Marcus found himself frozen. The paper remained in his pocket while his mind spiraled through everything David had just told him. David wouldn't lie about something like this, not on Marcus's wedding day, not unless he was absolutely certain. They'd been friends for over a decade, had stood by each other through college heartbreaks, job losses, family deaths. David had never once given Marcus bad advice or steered him wrong. "Marcus?" Pastor Williams prompted gently, probably thinking the groom was just overwhelmed with emotion. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. Marcus could hear people shifting in their seats, could sense the subtle change in energy as the assembled guests began to wonder if something was wrong. His mother's expression had shifted from joy to concern. Sarah's smile was becoming strained, and she squeezed his hands as if to encourage him to continue. That squeeze broke something inside Marcus. The physical gesture of reassurance from someone who had been deceiving him, possibly for months, felt like the ultimate betrayal. He looked at Sarah's face, really studied it, and saw a stranger. How had he missed the signs? How had he been so blind to what was happening right in front of him? The questions that had been nagging at him for months suddenly made perfect sense. Why Sarah had insisted on keeping their finances completely separate, even after the engagement. Why she'd been so adamant about not living together before the wedding. Why she'd started working out at a different gym without explanation. Why her phone was always face down when they were together. Why she'd become so interested in girls' nights and weekend trips with friends he'd never met. Pastor Williams tried again. "Marcus, whenever you're ready," but Marcus wasn't ready. He might never be ready for this moment, this choice between the life he'd planned and the truth that was staring him in the face. He could go through with the ceremony, pretend David had never said anything, marry Sarah and try to work through whatever was happening later in private. That would be the safe choice, the choice that wouldn't destroy a $15,000 wedding and humiliate both families in front of 300 guests. Or he could choose the truth. He could trust his best friend, trust his own instincts that had been trying to warn him for months, and stop this charade before it became legally binding. He could save himself from entering a marriage built on lies, even if it meant creating the most awkward and devastating moment of his life. The weight of the decision felt crushing. 300 people waited in silence. The photographer was still taking pictures, capturing what she thought was a groom overcome with emotion. Sarah's grip on his hands was getting tighter, and he could see real panic starting to creep into her eyes. She knew. Somehow, she knew that he knew, or at least suspected something was terribly wrong. Marcus realized this was the most important decision he would ever make. Not just about Sarah, not just about their marriage, but about the kind of man he wanted to be. Did he want to be someone who ignored red flags for the sake of appearances? Someone who accepted being lied to and cheated on because it was easier than facing the truth? Someone who valued other people's comfort over his own integrity? The answer came to him with stunning clarity. He knew exactly what kind of man he wanted to be, and it wasn't the kind who started his marriage by pretending he didn't know his bride was unfaithful. Some moments define us completely, and this was his moment of definition. He looked at Sarah one more time, seeing not the woman he'd fallen in love with, but someone who had been systematically deceiving him while he planned their future together. The sadness he felt was overwhelming, not just for the relationship that was ending, but for the version of himself that had been naive enough to miss all the signs. Then Marcus made his choice. Marcus took a deep breath and felt something shift inside him, like a door opening to a room he'd never known existed. The fear was still there, but underneath it was something stronger, a crystalline certainty about what he had to do. He looked at Sarah, then at Pastor Williams, then out at the sea of expectant faces watching from their white wooden chairs. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the silent terrace. "I can't do this." The words hung in the mountain air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to burn. For a moment, nobody moved. Pastor Williams blinked in confusion. Sarah's face went completely white, and 300 guests sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they'd just heard. Sarah's grip on his hands tightened to the point of pain. "Marcus, what are you doing?" she whispered urgently, her voice pitched so low that only he and the people on the altar could hear her. "This isn't the time. We can talk about whatever this is later." But Marcus was past the point of private conversations and damage control. Something about standing in front of all these people, about being asked to make sacred vows while knowing they were built on lies, had crystallized his resolve in a way that surprised even him. "No," he said, pulling his hands free from hers. "We can't talk about this later, Sarah. We should have talked about this months ago." He turned to address the assembled guests, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I apologize to everyone who traveled here today, who took time from your lives to celebrate what you thought was going to be our marriage. You deserve to know why this ceremony isn't going to continue." Sarah grabbed his arm, her manicured nails digging into the fabric of his tuxedo. "Marcus, stop. Please don't do this. Not like this." Her voice was desperate now, all pretense of the blushing bride completely gone. "Whatever David told you, we can work through it. Don't ruin everything because of some misunderstanding." The fact that she immediately knew David was involved told Marcus everything he needed to know. She wasn't denying it, wasn't asking what he was talking about, wasn't expressing confusion or hurt at being accused of something she hadn't done. She was trying to minimize it, to reduce her betrayal to a misunderstanding that could be worked through later in private. Marcus looked out at the crowd again. His parents were staring at him with expressions of complete bewilderment. Sarah's mother had her hand over her mouth in horror. The photographer was still taking pictures, probably out of professional instinct, documenting what was quickly becoming the most dramatic wedding disaster anyone there had ever witnessed. 3 days ago, Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly across the terrace, "My best man saw my fiancée with another man at a hotel in downtown Portland. Not a business meeting, not a coincidence. They were together in a way that made it clear this has been going on for some time." The gasp from the crowd was audible, like air being sucked out of the atmosphere. Sarah made a sound that was half sob, half protest. But Marcus continued, "I've spent the last 10 minutes standing here trying to decide if I should go through with this ceremony anyway, if I should marry someone I now know has been lying to me, because I was worried about embarrassing everyone here. But then I realized something important." He paused, looking directly at Sarah. "I'd rather embarrass myself by telling the truth than humiliate myself by pretending I don't know it." Sarah was crying now, mascara starting to run down her cheeks, despite the expensive waterproof formula her makeup artist had sworn would last through anything. "Marcus, please, let me explain. It's not what you think. It's complicated." "It's really not complicated at all," Marcus replied, and he felt a strange sense of calm settling over him. "Either you're faithful to the person you're about to marry, or you're not. Either you're honest with them, or you're not. There's nothing complicated about that." He turned to Pastor Williams, who was standing there looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "Pastor Williams, I'm sorry to put you in this position, but this ceremony is over. There won't be a marriage today." Then Marcus did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He walked over to the microphone that had been set up for the ceremony and tapped it gently. The sound echoed across the terrace, ensuring that every single person there could hear what he was about to say. "I want to thank everyone who came here today," he began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was doing. "I know many of you traveled long distances and spent money you couldn't afford to celebrate what you thought was going to be one of the happiest days of our lives. I'm sorry that it turned out differently." The crowd was completely silent now. Even the string quartet had stopped playing, their instruments forgotten as they stared at the unfolding drama. "I've learned something important today about the difference between the life you think you want and the life you actually deserve. I thought I wanted a perfect wedding, a perfect marriage, a perfect future with someone who seemed perfect for me. But perfect isn't real if it's built on lies. Perfect isn't worth anything if you have to pretend not to know the truth to maintain it." Marcus could see people throughout the crowd nodding slightly, understanding beginning to dawn on their faces. His college roommate was shaking his head in amazement. His mother was crying, but he could see that mixed with her tears was something that looked like pride. "I'm 32 years old," Marcus continued, "and I've spent most of my adult life trying to be the kind of man who doesn't cause problems, who goes along with things, who values other people's comfort over his own integrity. But standing here today, I realized that's not the kind of man I want to be anymore." He looked directly at Sarah, who was still standing beside him in her beautiful wedding dress, looking like she wanted to disappear into the mountain itself. "Sarah, I loved you. I really did. But I loved the person I thought you were, not the person you actually are. And you deserve to be with someone who loves you for who you actually are, just like I deserve to be with someone who's honest with me." The silence that followed was profound. Marcus could hear the wind rustling through the evergreen trees, could hear someone's child asking their parent what was happening, could hear his own heartbeat slowing down for the first time since David had whispered those 4 life-changing words. Then he made one final decision that would define not just this moment, but the man he was becoming. "The reception is paid for," Marcus announced to the crowd. "The food is prepared, the bar is open, and there's a DJ ready to play music. I'm not going to be there, and I assume Sarah won't be either, but the rest of you should stay and enjoy yourselves. Consider it a celebration of truth-telling, or just a really expensive party on Mount Hood. Either way, don't let our drama ruin your weekend." With that, Marcus Thompson walked off the altar of his own wedding, past 300 stunned guests, past his parents and Sarah's parents, past the photographer who was still capturing every moment, and toward a future he couldn't imagine but knew would be built on something real. He had no idea what came next, but for the first time in years, he felt like himself. Marcus walked through the lodge and out to the parking lot, his polished dress shoes crunching on the gravel with each step. Behind him, he could hear the murmur of 300 voices beginning to process what had just happened, but he didn't turn around. He made it to the black SUV that had brought him up the mountain and sat in the driver's seat, his hands shaking as he tried to fit the key into the ignition. David found him there 5 minutes later, still sitting in the parking lot, staring through the windshield at Mount Hood's snow-covered peak. "Marcus," David said, opening the passenger door and sliding in beside him. "I'm sorry, man. I'm so fucking sorry. I shouldn't have told you like that, not right before the ceremony. I just couldn't watch you promise your life to someone who was cheating on you." Marcus turned to look at his best friend, really seeing him for the first time that day. David's face was etched with guilt and pain, but underneath it was relief. "How long have you known?" Marcus asked. 6 weeks, David admitted. I saw them at the Heathman Hotel downtown. I was there for a work meeting, and I saw Sarah in the lobby with some guy I'd never seen before. They were intimate, holding hands, kissing, acting like a couple. I followed them to the elevator, and they got off on the 7th floor together. The details hit Marcus like individual punches. Did you recognize him? I didn't at first, but I did some digging. His name is Connor Walsh. He works for the same real estate firm as Sarah, but in their Seattle office. Apparently, he's been coming to Portland for training sessions every few weeks for the past 6 months. 6 months. The timeline made perfect sense now. Sarah's increased business trips, her new interest in professional development conferences, her sudden need for privacy with her phone and her schedule. She'd been building a relationship with someone else while planning a wedding with Marcus. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Marcus asked, though he wasn't angry. He was genuinely curious about his friend's thought process. David was quiet for a long moment. Because I hoped I was wrong. Because I kept thinking maybe there was some explanation that would make it innocent. Because I knew telling you would destroy everything. And I wasn't sure if you'd want me to do that or not. Marcus started the SUV and began driving down the mountain, neither of them speaking for several miles. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two men processing something too big for words. The autumn landscape rolled past them, beautiful and indifferent to human drama. What are you going to do now? David finally asked. I have no idea, Marcus replied, and found that the uncertainty didn't scare him the way he thought it would. I guess I'm going to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to be someone's perfect fiancé. The first few weeks after what the internet quickly dubbed the Mount Hood wedding disaster were surreal. The story spread through social media faster than Marcus could have imagined. Someone had recorded his speech on their phone, and within hours it was viral on TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram. Comments poured in from strangers around the world, most of them supportive, praising his courage and honesty. This man just showed every woman what self-respect looks like, one comment read. Imagine having the strength to choose truth over convenience, said another. The way he handled this with dignity instead of anger is incredible. But it wasn't just internet strangers who were impressed. Marcus found himself receiving calls and messages from people he hadn't heard from in years. His high school girlfriend reached out to tell him she was proud of him. A college professor sent a letter saying Marcus's actions reminded him why he'd always believed in his student's character. Most surprisingly, Marcus received a call from Tom Richardson, the CEO of a boutique marketing firm in Seattle. Tom had seen the viral video and been impressed not just by Marcus's honesty, but by his composure and communication skills under pressure. Anyone who can deliver a speech like that in the most stressful moment of their life is someone I want working for me, Tom told him during their phone interview. Within 6 weeks of walking away from his wedding, Marcus had a new job offer that would double his salary and relocate him to Seattle. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was moving to the same city where Sarah had been conducting her affair, but Seattle was big enough for both of them, and the opportunity was too good to pass up. The hardest part of those weeks wasn't dealing with the public attention or the career changes. It was facing the financial reality of canceling a wedding. Marcus was out $15,000 for the venue, $12,000 for the catering, and thousands more for flowers, photography, and music. His savings account, which had been steadily building toward a down payment on a larger house, was completely wiped out. But even facing financial ruin, Marcus found he didn't regret his decision. Every morning when he woke up, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months: peace. The constant low-level anxiety he'd been carrying, the nagging feeling that something was wrong but not being able to identify what, was completely gone. He slept better, ate better, and found himself laughing more than he had in years. Sarah tried to contact him multiple times in the weeks following the wedding. She left voicemails, sent text messages, even showed up at his house once. Her story kept changing with each attempt at communication. First, she claimed Marcus had misunderstood what David had seen. Then she admitted to an emotional affair, but insisted it hadn't gotten physical. Finally, in a tearful voicemail, left at 2 a.m. 3 weeks after the wedding, she confessed that she'd been seeing Connor for 6 months and thought she loved them both. Marcus listened to that voicemail exactly once, then deleted it. He felt sad for Sarah, but not in the way he'd expected. He wasn't heartbroken or angry or bitter. Instead, he felt the kind of sadness you feel when you see someone making choices that are obviously going to hurt them. Sarah had thrown away a relationship with someone who genuinely loved her for an affair that, according to David's continued research, Connor was also conducting with at least one other woman. The move to Seattle happened in January 2025. Marcus found a one-bedroom apartment in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, walking distance from his new office and close to some of the best coffee shops and restaurants in the city. For the first time since college, he was living alone, making decisions based solely on what he wanted rather than what worked for a couple. The job at Richardson Marketing exceeded every expectation Marcus had. Tom Richardson turned out to be a mentor as much as a boss, someone who valued creativity and independent thinking over following established procedures. Marcus found himself working on campaigns for tech startups, local restaurants, and environmental nonprofits, projects that felt meaningful in ways his previous job never had. More importantly, the work environment encouraged the kind of person Marcus was becoming rather than the kind of person he'd been trying to be. His colleagues appreciated his honesty and directness, qualities that had sometimes gotten him in trouble in his more corporate previous position. He found himself speaking up in meetings, proposing bold strategies, and taking creative risks that would have terrified the old Marcus. 6 months after the wedding disaster, Marcus was having coffee with a new colleague, Rachel Martinez. When she asked him the question everyone seemed to want to ask, but rarely did, "Do you ever regret what you did? Walking away like that in front of everyone?" Marcus considered the question seriously, the way he'd learned to consider most things since that day on Mount Hood. "You know, I think about that a lot," he finally answered. "And honestly, no, I don't regret it at all. I regret that I ignored the warning signs for so long. I regret that I let it get to the point where the truth had to come out in such a public way. But I don't regret choosing honesty over convenience." "That must have taken incredible courage," Rachel said, and Marcus could see genuine admiration in her eyes. "I don't think it was courage," Marcus replied. "I think it was just finally being tired of pretending. You can only live someone else's version of your life for so long before it starts eating you alive from the inside." That conversation marked a turning point for Marcus. He realized that the person he'd become since the wedding wasn't just someone who'd survived a crisis. He was someone who'd been liberated by it. The Marcus who'd been planning to marry Sarah had been playing it safe, following a script written by social expectations and family traditions. The Marcus who walked away from that altar was writing his own script, making choices based on his own values rather than other people's expectations. By his 33rd birthday in March 2025, Marcus's life looked nothing like what he'd planned a year earlier, and everything like what he actually wanted. He had a job he loved, friends who respected him for who he really was, and for the first time in years, he was excited about the future instead of just going through the motions of living it. The viral fame from the wedding video had mostly died down, but occasionally someone would recognize him on the street or in a coffee shop. Instead of being embarrassed by the attention, Marcus found he was proud of what that moment represented. He'd become a symbol of choosing authenticity over appearances, of valuing truth over comfort, of believing that people deserve better than relationships built on lies. But the real transformation wasn't in how other people saw him. It was in how he saw himself. 1 year later, Marcus Thompson stood on another mountain, but this time he was alone by choice. Mount Rainier stretched out before him, its snow-covered peak glowing pink in the early morning light. He'd driven up here to mark the anniversary of what he'd come to think of as his Independence Day, the moment when he'd chosen truth over comfort and changed the entire trajectory of his life. The hike to this viewpoint had taken 3 hours, and Marcus had used every minute of it to reflect on the journey that had brought him here. 12 months ago, he'd been a man living someone else's definition of success, engaged to someone who was systematically lying to him, planning a future built on a foundation of deception. Today, he was someone he genuinely liked and respected, someone who made decisions based on his own values rather than other people's expectations. The professional success had been unexpected, but welcome. Richardson Marketing had promoted him to senior director after just 8 months, recognizing not just his marketing skills, but his leadership abilities and his talent for inspiring authentic communication in others. His salary had increased by 130% since leaving Portland. But more importantly, he woke up every morning excited about the work he was doing. The personal growth had been even more dramatic. Marcus had spent the past year learning to be comfortable with his own company, to make decisions without constantly seeking approval from others, to trust his instincts even when they led him away from the safe or conventional choice. He'd taken up hiking, learned to cook properly, started reading philosophy books, and discovered that he actually enjoyed being single more than he'd enjoyed being in a relationship built on lies. He'd also learned to set boundaries in ways he never had before. When Sarah had continued trying to contact him throughout the year, alternately apologizing and blaming him for humiliating her, Marcus had eventually blocked her number entirely. When his mother had suggested that maybe he should try to reconcile with Sarah because everyone makes mistakes, Marcus had calmly but firmly explained that some mistakes are actually choices, and that he deserved to be with someone who chose to be honest with him. The most surprising development had been his relationship with David. Their friendship had not only survived the crisis but had deepened in ways Marcus hadn't expected. David's decision to tell the truth, even knowing it would destroy Marcus's wedding, had been an act of genuine courage and loyalty. It had cost David significantly as well, as many people in their friend group had initially blamed him for ruining Marcus's big day. But as time passed and the full story came out, people began to understand that David had made the hardest choice a friend can make, telling someone you love a truth they don't want to hear. 6 months after the wedding disaster, David had moved to Seattle as well, taking a job at Microsoft and finding an apartment just a few miles from Marcus. Their weekly hiking trips had become a ritual. 2 men who'd learned that real friendship means caring more about someone's long-term well-being than their short-term comfort. As Marcus stood on the mountain that morning, watching the sunrise paint the Cascade Range in shades of gold and pink, he thought about the lessons that had emerged from the worst and best day of his life. The first lesson was about the difference between courage and desperation. He'd spent months after the wedding wondering if what he'd done was brave or just impulsive, but he'd come to understand that sometimes desperation and courage look exactly the same from the outside. Sometimes you have to be desperate enough to change before you can find the courage to do it. The second lesson was about the cost of living someone else's life. Marcus had spent years trying to be the kind of man he thought he should be, rather than the kind of man he actually was. He'd valued stability over authenticity, appearance over truth, other people's comfort over his own integrity. The cost of that choice had been enormous. His sense of self, his ability to trust his own instincts, his peace of mind, and ultimately his ability to build genuine relationships with people who knew and loved him for who he really was. The third lesson was about the power of public accountability. Standing up in front of 300 people and telling the truth about Sarah's betrayal had been terrifying, but it had also been liberating in ways Marcus was still discovering. When you stop hiding from difficult truths, when you stop pretending that problems don't exist or that you're okay with things that actually hurt you, you give other people permission to do the same. Marcus had received hundreds of messages from people who said his wedding speech had inspired them to end their own dishonest relationships, leave jobs that were making them miserable, or simply start telling the truth about their own lives. The fourth lesson was about the difference between love and attachment. Marcus had thought he loved Sarah, and in some ways he had. But what he'd really loved was the idea of her, the version of her that existed in his imagination, rather than the person she actually was. Real love, he'd learned, requires seeing someone clearly and choosing them anyway. Attachment, on the other hand, is about needing someone to be a certain way in order for you to feel okay about yourself. Marcus had been attached to the idea of being married, of having the kind of relationship that looked successful from the outside, of being the kind of man who could keep a beautiful woman happy. That attachment had made him blind to obvious red flags and willing to accept unacceptable behavior. The fifth and most important lesson was about the relationship between truth and freedom. For most of his adult life, Marcus had operated under the assumption that telling difficult truths would make his life harder and more complicated. What he'd discovered was exactly the opposite. Hiding from truth was what made life complicated, exhausting, and ultimately unsustainable. The moment he'd chosen to tell the truth about Sarah's betrayal, despite the social cost and personal embarrassment, he'd freed himself from the exhausting work of pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. Standing on Mount Rainier that morning, Marcus felt a deep sense of gratitude for the crisis that had changed everything. Without David's whispered revelation, without the shock of discovering Sarah's betrayal, without the public humiliation of calling off his own wedding, he might have spent years or even decades living a life that looked successful from the outside, but felt empty from the inside. He might have married someone who was deceiving him, built a family on a foundation of lies, and spent his life wondering why he never felt quite right about any of it. Instead, he'd been given the gift of a crisis that forced him to choose between the life he thought he wanted and the life he actually deserved. He'd chosen authenticity over appearance, truth over comfort, and his own integrity over other people's expectations. The cost had been significant: financial stress, public embarrassment, the end of a 4-year relationship, and the complete reconstruction of his identity and his future. But the benefits had been even greater: self-respect, genuine relationships, meaningful work, and the deep peace that comes from living in alignment with your own values. As Marcus began the hike back down the mountain, he thought about the people who might hear this story and wonder if they had the courage to make similar choices in their own lives. He thought about the marriages built on secrets, the jobs that drain people's souls, the friendships that require constant pretending, the family relationships that depend on never talking about important things. He thought about all the ways people compromise their own authenticity in service of other people's comfort, and how exhausting and ultimately unsustainable that kind of living really is. The truth Marcus had learned was this: you can't build a genuine life on a foundation of lies, not even small ones, not even well-intentioned ones. Every compromise you make with your own integrity, every time you pretend to be okay with something that actually hurts you, every relationship you maintain by hiding important truths, takes you further away from the person you actually are and the life you actually want. But here's the hopeful part: it's never too late to choose differently. It's never too late to start telling the truth, to start living authentically, to start building relationships with people who know and love you for who you really are. It might be messy, it might be scary, it might cost you relationships and opportunities that were built on false pretenses. But what you'll gain is something infinitely more valuable: the ability to look at yourself in the mirror and recognize the person looking back at you. Marcus's story isn't just about a man who walked away from his wedding. It's about what happens when someone finally gets tired of living someone else's version of their life and decides to write their own script instead. It's about the courage to choose authenticity over appearance, truth over comfort, and personal integrity over social expectations. Most importantly, it's about the incredible freedom that comes from building a life that's genuinely yours, rather than one that just looks good from the outside. If you're someone who's been living a version of your life that doesn't quite fit, if you've been compromising your own authenticity to maintain relationships or opportunities that require you to be someone other than who you are, then Marcus's story is for you. Change is possible. Truth-telling is possible. Building a life that actually reflects your values and your authentic self is possible. It might not be easy, but it's absolutely worth it. The mountain taught Marcus something important that morning. Sometimes you have to climb higher to see clearly. Sometimes you have to get distance from your old life to understand what your new life could look like. And sometimes the most beautiful views are only accessible to people who are willing to take the difficult path. The easy path, the safe path, the path that everyone else expects you to take, often leads to valleys where you can't see very far in any direction. But the difficult path, the authentic path, the path that requires you to tell the truth, even when it's scary, leads to peaks where you can see for miles and finally understand where you've been and where you're going. As Marcus drove back to Seattle that afternoon, he felt more grateful than he ever had for David's courage in telling him the truth, for his own courage in acting on it, and for the crisis that had forced him to become the person he was always meant to be. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is also the best thing that happens to you. Sometimes getting your heart broken is actually getting your life back. And sometimes walking away from everything you thought you wanted is the first step toward everything you actually need. If this story resonated with you, if you found yourself inspired by Marcus's journey from living someone else's life to creating his own, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to choose between comfort and truth? What would you do if you discovered that your perfect life was built on lies? Your stories and insights not only help me create better content, but also inspire others who might be facing similar crossroads in their own lives. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of transformation and courage, and hit that like button if you believe everyone deserves to live authentically. Thank you for taking this journey with Marcus and me.